And so this book, what we now call The Journey to the West, was published in Chinese in 1592 anonymously, because although fiction was very popular, it was seen as a disreputable thing for literati to do. You know, sort of poetry and essays and painting were the really respectable cultural pursuits, not fiction. So we don't know. We have some educated guesses about who wrote it, but we can't know exactly. Okay, so now sort of cut to a very, very quick plot overview. The novel starts with a 7-chapter prologue introducing the Sun Wukong, the Monkey King figure. It talks about his sort of legendary birth and how he acquires a range of extraordinary superpowers. So, for example, he can travel 108,000 miles in a single somersault. He is immortal. He will live forever. He can transform into all sorts of different things, or he can transform parts of his body into different things. So, you know, he can create a whole army of little monkeys by just pulling hairs out of his arm, chewing them up and spitting them out, and they become armies of monkeys. But he's a flawed individual as well. He's arrogant, he's mischievous, and he gets into terrible trouble when he is invited up to heaven. This is the Taoist heaven. So there are lots of ideas about Chinese religion throughout the book. It's a really sort of interesting guide to the kind of cocktail of ideas in Chinese religion. So he is, and Taoism is a really important thread going through the book. So the Jade Emperor, the ruler, the ultimate ruler of the Taoist universe and heaven, invites him up to heaven to take up sort of various quite lowly jobs. But Monkey gets offended that he's not been given a better job, and he causes terrible trouble in heaven. He guzzles all the peaches and the wine and the elixirs of immortality that have been prepared for a once in 10,000 years banquet. And this generates an enormous battle with the forces of heaven, and eventually the Buddha. So again, sort of very syncretic approach to religion here. You have, you know, the Indian Buddha helping out his friend, the Jade Emperor, in the Taoist Chinese universe. The Buddha gets control of Monkey, and to punish him for all his wrongdoing, pins him under a mountain, and he stays there for the next 500 years until he's learnt to be a better monkey. At that point, he is released in the 7th century AD, to sort of give it a kind of mythological, historical marker here. He is released in order to redeem his sins by escorting the Chinese Buddhist monk Tripitaka on his pilgrimage out of China and to India. And the rest of the book, sort of roughly 90 or so chapters, is an account of the horrendous challenges and trials that he, Tripitaka, and 2 other disciples, a pig demon called Pigsy and a river demon called Sandy. It's an account of the appalling challenges that they have to undergo in order to get to India. So there are countless man-eating monsters who all want to have a piece of Tripitaka's flesh because they think this will win them immortal life. Interestingly, all these monsters seem to commit the classic mistake of, for example, James Bond villains. So, you know, James Bond villains have so many opportunities to kill James Bond, but they never get round to it because they're so busy telling James Bond how they're going to do it, so they don't actually do the deed. So the equivalent for Journey to the West, Monkey King, is these demons have many opportunities actually to eat Tripitaka, but because they are also good Confucians, they're always too busy inviting their parents and their senior relatives to enjoy the feast. So by the time that letter has been dispatched to the relatives, clever old Monkey has come up with a cunning plan to defeat the monsters and release Tripitaka. Anyway, on it goes across these 100 chapters until, spoiler alert, they manage to get to India, pick up the sutras, drop them back in Tang, China, in Chang'an, and then return to India to become immortals in the Buddha's own government. And that is Journey to the West.
Great. Julia, I'm in reading both the introduction to the book and also a conversation you had with, I believe, Jeffrey Wasserstrom at the LA Review of Books. You told some really, I thought, lovely stories about how you first encountered Monkey King: Journey to the West as a child, and seeing that that offbeat TV show, but also that more recently your son has become quite interested in the story. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, interestingly, Journey to the West was actually, to my knowledge, my first contact with East Asian culture. To give you some context, I grew up in remote parts of provincial England in the 1980s. And these were times and places where China seemed almost to exist on another planet. It felt so distant from ordinary life. But on Saturday mornings, I would sit in front of the TV, mesmerized by a show called Monkey. And only years later, I realized that this was actually a Japanese adaptation of Journey to the West. In terms of the show itself, the production values were low, the dubbing was clumsy. The characters and the situations were just so hilariously eccentric and fantastical that it became a cultural phenomenon for me and many of my generation in the UK and also in Australia. I don't think that American TV bought the show. So I've just been struck how many times when I've been talking about the project of translating this book to friends, and they look a little bit blank, and then I say, it's the book that the TV show Monkey was based on, and this sort of absolute light of recognition and enthusiasm comes over their faces. So for some reason, for me and my fellow Generation Xers, it really was cult. Now, much later, when I was a university student of Chinese, I actually read the whole novel first in Arthur Waley's 1940s translation and abridgment, and then in Anthony Yu's full version. And at that point, I began to appreciate the richness and the complexity of the novel. So all its spiritual elements, everything that it tells us about Chinese society and religion. But the aspects that had appealed to me so much as a child also still held. So things like the extraordinary fantasy sequences, Monkey's rebellion and irreverence, and the really sort of crazy out there monsters and demons. And a couple of years ago, I rediscovered that old 1980s TV show with my teenage son, and I was struck by how he too was immediately entranced and entertained by it, even to the point that on social media he uses the face of the monkey character as his avatar and includes as his motto the opening credits summary of Monkey, Sun Wukong, which goes, "The nature of monkey was irrepressible." And so my children are quite spaced out in age. There's one who's 17, one who's 15, so it's the 15-year-old who really took to Monkey so much. I also have an 8-year-old, and a few weeks ago, we watched another adaptation, this time of another adaptation of part of the Monkey story, part of Journey to the West. This time it was an animation done by a Shanghai studio in the 1960s. So again, a sort of time and a place which is very far removed from my 8-year-old's everyday sort of sphere of reference. But I was struck by how he too was he immediately, he loved the visuals. It's very, very beautiful cartoon. But he also just loved the character. There's obviously something universal about the appeal of a naughty monkey to children in all times and places.
And Gabor mentioned this too, and I think this is quite interesting. And the editor at the Asian Review of Books also noticed this. It seems, at least from a lay perspective, that you have really aimed this at a younger audience. I mean, we call them a Gen Z audience, perhaps. The language that you use in your translations is current, and the cover has a great sort of well, your son likes it. It's his avatar for for his online presence. That's it, yeah. And your foreword by Yang is by one of the, very well-known, what you call them, representers in at least the American world of a Chinese perspective, but to young people in his graphic novels. Tell us, that's quite curious. It's an interesting thing that you've done. As Gabor suggested, you've taken a classic and you've made it hip. Tell us about that a bit. I think that's quite fascinating.
Thanks very much for that really smart observation. With this translation, as with the other two translations of the classics that I've done, so I've also translated the very famous modern novelist Lu Xun, and the wonderful female writer of 1940s Shanghai, Zhang Ailing. And all those books were published by Penguin Classics. And so while doing these particular translations, I was very conscious of trying to write for a mixed readership. So there was the specialist East Asian studies readership. There was a broader academic readership of students in comparative literatures, people interested in learning more about early modern Chinese fiction. And there was also the broader general audience who, through the brand of Penguin Classics, like to explore unfamiliar voices in translation from national literatures from parts of the world that they might not otherwise venture towards. So that's a very challengingly diverse range of readers, trying to come up with a version that will both satisfy the specialist, be useful for specialist teaching purposes, and also hopefully appeal to a much broader, more general audience. And at the moment, I'm listening hard to feedback to understand how I've done with each group. As for age group, though, I do hope that the book might work for a bigger range than, say, my translations of Lu Xun. Lu Xun is a writer who has a very bleak, acerbic voice, which is, definitely quite bleakly adult. I'd say that there's also, plenty of kind of adult depth to Journey to the West. There's so much about ideas of religion and spirituality there. There's Monkey's overarching moral arc of redemption from Hellraiser to virtuous Buddhist. So, that's one of the strong themes across the novel, that Monkey has to find ways to redeem himself, to temper himself as a troublemaker. So there's a lot that is deep and that's complex, but there's also it's a very open text, and there's also a good deal about the book that's appealingly childlike. For example, what I described just now, the prologue, in which Monkey gets himself into such terrible trouble in heaven, he completely fails to think through the consequences of gobbling all these immortal peaches, wine, and elixirs. And while I was working on the translation, I always kept in mind that my children have loved this story since I read it to them when they were tiny. And they still love the story, even though two of them are teenagers. And I'm definitely getting nice feedback from friends that they're enjoying reading the book to their children from primary school age onwards. In terms of the choice of the cover and the title, those were guided by my wonderful editor in New York, a man called John Siciliano, who's just done so much to commission new translations of Chinese classics into English. And I think he was trying to combine two elements. Obviously, he wanted to have the title of the original, so that would speak to more specialist audiences. So the half the title is Journey to the West. The first half of the title is Monkey King, and I think that was definitely speaking to the sort of very broad appeal and impact of the image of the Monkey King, not just in literature, but perhaps above all in popular culture. So again, sort of taking it back to a personal family story, my two sons enjoy playing a video game which has all sorts of superhero characters, but including the Monkey King. So I think that the Monkey King is one of these characters that has it's got a sort of high literature presence, but he's also seeped out into popular culture. So I think it was trying to sort of ring bells with and sort of resonate with audiences who might not have encountered the book, but might have encountered the Monkey King character in various pop culture, non-literary media.
How's the book doing? It's been out 6 months now, a little less?
A little bit less, actually. So it's just a couple of months, actually. So it came out in February. I've had some really nice responses to it from sort of specialist readers and sinologists through to much more general readers. And I was happy with one review, and I think you also mentioned this in your review, John, that talked about it, the translation and the abridgment that I've done as almost a kind of gateway text. So it sort of draws readers in without being intimidatingly long, as the original can, the full original can strike readers as being. And hopefully what the review was saying is that if this whets your appetite, go back to the full translation, because we have two wonderful full translations of the book, one by Anthony Yu, one by Bill Jenner. So I hope that my abridgment will sort of appeal in a standalone way, but will also bring more and more people to explore the original in its entirety.
And the original is the translations are like 4 volumes, right?
Yeah. So it is very long. It's 100 chapters. It's very long in the original. So I think it's also, there are certain aspects of the structure of the original that lend themselves quite easily to the concept of an abridgment. So a lot of the book, once you've introduced the monkey character and once you've introduced the main characters, a lot of the challenges and the trials that the characters undergo on their way out of China to India are episodic in structure. So they're quite, the stories are quite independent. Very few of them bring up characters which then appear later on, apart from the core characters of the disciples, the pilgrims, and the big gods, so sort of Buddha and the Jade Emperor and so on. There's a certain amount of repetition also in the full version of the book. As I say, there are just so many man-eating monsters on the Silk Road. So I feel from that perspective it's a book that absolutely repays going back to it in its entirety. But it's also a book that you can pull out certain themes from and decide to translate the most compelling iterations of those themes. So both approaches work.
Uh, so what you've done is you've basically taken the best 25%, or at least the most relevant 25% for your particular goal. And
There were sort of 2 or 3 different stages or different techniques that I used to abridge. First, of course, I read the whole book myself, and I noted which episodes I liked best, and which episodes highlighted what I thought were the most interesting themes and situations in the most compelling ways. The next thing I did is, I was very aware that 2 of my predecessors in translating the book, Arthur Waley and Anthony Yu, both completed abridgments. So Arthur Waley's was just an abridgment, whereas Anthony Yu did both the full version and an abridged version of it. So I drew up a table comparing their choices, Waley's and Yu's choices, against the contents of the whole book. So I worked out what they had included and what they had left out. And obviously, I was keen to include at least some episodes that hadn't been included in previous abridgments. I wanted to distinguish in some way my own approach. One example is that for whatever reasons, Arthur Waley didn't choose to translate the episodes that had very strong women or female demons in them. These episodes have thought-provoking and sometimes quite subversive takes on gender dynamics. There's one in particular where the pilgrims fall pregnant when they travel through the land of women. So this is a land where there are no men, and so in order to become pregnant, there's a special magic river that women drink from, and when the pilgrims are entering this land, they don't know about this. They get thirsty and they glug a few mouthfuls from the river, and blow me down, in a few hours they're approaching childbirth. So it's quite terrifyingly rapid process. So as the first female translator and abridger, translator and abridger of this story, or the first, I think there was maybe one female abridger right at the beginning of the 20th century, but I was certainly the first to approach it in quite a long while. I really felt that those sorts of episodes, which told us interesting things about gender relations, were a must for me. So there's some very interesting moments when the pilgrims are passing through the land of women, and you really get a sense of everything being topsy-turvy in terms of gender power dynamics. So the pilgrims are all male, and they really start to experience a world in which gender dynamics are very unequal, but rather than it being men having power over women, it's women having the power to kind of sort of gape in quite a sort of sexualized way at the disciples. Yes, they become pregnant, so they discover the extreme discomforts of childbirth, and what the Xuanzang Tripitaka is forced by the powerful queen into an arranged marriage. So I thought that was extremely eye-opening. But the final aspect of the abridgment was I also compressed some of the language in individual chapters in order to make more room for individual episodes. So I think my abridgment covers more episodes than Arthur Waley did in his abridgment from the 1940s, and I had a very strict word limit. It couldn't go beyond 100,000 words. So the Chinese novel, the 1592 version, has its origins in oral storytelling, and it quite often recapitulates elements of the story so far, as if it's being told by a storyteller in the marketplace, worried that listeners might have wandered off between scenes or just forgotten key details. So I left out those repetitions because I don't think they're needed once you've written down the version.
This is when you're talking about the pilgrims becoming pregnant, we just got a very interesting question that came across, and I'll take this time to start to invite others to ask questions too. If I may, I'd like to read from Young's foreword, just a one bit here. He says, Superman, Spider-Man, and Captain America were simply Western expressions of everything I loved about the Monkey King. Superman's epic battle with Doomsday echoes the Monkey King's epic battle with Red Boy. And he goes on to describe other superheroes. And, you know, for anybody, I think, coming to this fresh, that's from the Anglophone world, that's obviously one thing we think, oh, this is like a Chinese version of blah. I kind of thought Star Wars or Lord of the Rings. And I think you mentioned Lord of the Rings in one of the reviews I saw, but this somebody from our group here, Harold, has asked a really interesting question, which I never thought about. And he says, what do you think about the comparison of Journey to Pilgrim's Progress?
Yeah, very, very, very interesting question. I did think quite a lot when I was writing my introduction about points of comparison with European writings about spiritual quests and religion of roughly the same time. And there's really interesting points of overlap. So, you know, one really interesting point is, you know, some analysts of Journey to the West have argued that although it's called Journey to the West, which seems very clearly to say this is a journey to the West, but they have argued that it's actually not a physical journey at all. It's a spiritual or a moral journey, you know, this question of the disciples being tempered by their suffering. And, you know, there are some quite revealing features of the book that might evidence that, you know, the landscape that the pilgrims travel through doesn't really change very much. It's the sort of similar sequence of sort of mountains and deserts and rivers and so on and so forth, and sort of different sorts of city states. They don't seem to struggle with foreign languages. Well, we don't hear about them struggling with foreign languages. Maybe they, to bring a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy reference here, maybe they have a Babel fish in their ear, but this is not mentioned. So there's this sort of sense of things still remaining quite recognizably Chinese, and the same religious establishment government hierarchy holds sway. So, you know, it's the deities, the spirits of the Taoist heaven who can be called on at pretty much any time. So again, you know, the Taoist heaven is sort of very much a sort of recognizably Sinophone Chinese cultural construct. And, you know, speaking to a very learned friend who knows, you know, so much about religious fictional texts of the late medieval through to early modern period in Europe, he said, you know, yeah, absolutely, in medieval romances you see a similar a sort of similar setup of a spiritual journey, described as a physical journey, but actually it's far more a spiritual journey. So I think it's really worthwhile, you know, not just trying to understand Journey to the West as a Chinese text. So it does tell us a huge amount about Chinese society, history, philosophy, and religion, but, you know, really trying to locate it within sort of broader comparative literary context is enormously worthwhile. I think, you know, other scholars have talked about how it sort of raises some of the ideas about identity and subjectivity, which were, you know, being discussed in the Ming period by philosophers like Wang Yangming, and how, you know, the book seems to take a very democratic approach, almost a kind of populist approach to its character. You know, many of the main characters, you know, are not perfect saints or gods. They're fallen immortals. They're the kind of demons. They're the in some ways the lowliest members of society, or the kind of Chinese social or religious ecosystem, but they're given center stage with all their kind of flaws and eccentricities, and again, this absolutely mirrors debates going on in Renaissance Europe, early modern Europe at the same time. So I think that's a wonderful line of inquiry.
Huh. I never thought of that. I will ask our audience to please put any questions they may have into the chat box, and we'll try to get to whichever ones we can. Julia, you've I think it's easy to say that your most popular recent book, or the most notable recent book, is Maoism, which is now about 2 years old, I think, right?
Yeah, that's exactly. That was 2019.
Right, and I like Gabor. I just thought it was an enormously valuable work, and if you have a few minutes to talk about what's happened since you published that, what sort of resonances that's had. I don't think it's available in China. Am I?
No, but there will be a complex character, full form character version. So I hope very much that Chinese Sinophone readers will find their way to it one way or another. Overall, the response to the book has been very positive. Above all, I've been glad to sense that readers are responding to the questions that I asked at the beginning of the book, especially the question, why didn't this book already exist before I wrote it? Given how many books we have about the global impact of Hitler or Stalin, and given that Mao is seen as a comparable figure with those two individuals, at least in Western historiography, I was very surprised that we didn't have a comparable number of studies of Mao's international influence. So I hope that the book has got people talking about why we haven't in the past seen Mao as a global phenomenon, as well as I hope the book has started conversations about the specifics of Maoism's international impact. But of course, the place where I really want to have conversation, I would love to have conversation about the book, is within China with Sinophone readers. I couldn't have written the book without the research of extraordinary group of mainland Chinese archival historians who've done so much important work on China during the Mao era, and especially China within the global Cold War. See, the events of the pandemic means I'm based in the UK. It's impossible for me to visit China at the moment, but I really hope that when I get back, I can start to have those conversations.
Well, when you do manage to get back, please be sure to let us know, because I can absolutely guarantee you that we'll have a warm seat waiting for you for any RAS talk you want to give.
Thank you so much.
You might be pleased to note also that there's a lively chat going on in the chat box here about where people can buy your book. So we'll hope that this conversation encourages some commercial advantage.
Yes, that's right. We are trying to figure it out. To everybody who's listening, usually I recommend that you buy it digitally, because these days it is much less of a problem than the physical book. But then if you insist on the physical book, then yes, indeed, we are discussing how to get it.
Yeah, somebody mentioned that Garden had it on sale in Shanghai, but it was sold out. So I don't know. So Julia, if I can return to your own academic work, your own publishing work, you've translated Lu Xun, Chang Ailing, now Sun Wukong and the Monkey King and the Journey of the West. uh, if I look at all these works, I mean, I think your title at Birkbeck is Professor of Modern Chinese History, if I'm not mistaken.
The full one is Modern Chinese History and Literature, because
Literature.
I started off really as a literature scholar, but inevitably literature does not exist in isolation from the society and history that produces us. So it was a very natural step to move into more sort of historical spheres of inquiry as well.
So aside from Journey to the West, everything you've worked on is 20th century. What's your next project? Sorry, forgive me, my computer's just behaved a bit oddly. Sorry. A couple of things. I took on my first translation project as a graduate student, so I was writing my PhD and also working on literary translation, and that's really become a habit that's never left me. I've always loved to have a literary translation alongside historical research and book projects. So I might be taking on a sort of wide-ranging anthology of classic Chinese short stories, all the way back to Zhuangzi in the 4th century BC through to the present day. You know, Zhuangzi, an absolutely remarkable storyteller. So that would be the translation, the literary side of the project. But I'm also returning. I have written about the 19th century. I've written about the Opium War, famously, yes,
in the book before Maoism.
Right.
So I've returned to the 19th century at the moment, but in a different way. So at the moment, I'm taking a deep dive into material culture. I'm working on an exhibition about China's last century as an empire, its long 19th century, with the British Museum, which will open in 2023. And, you know, searching for objects, sort of working out what is the narrative that we want to tell with this exhibition has been an amazing learning process for me. So in the past, I've tended to tell history through texts rather than through objects. I've used photographs, but it's tended to be two-dimensional things, text and photographs. But because the 19th century is so relatively modern, a remarkable number of astounding objects from high culture all the way down to everyday life survive from this period of history in China, despite the terrible, destructive wars, so foreign invasion and civil war, that tore the Qing Empire, that tore China apart during this era. And these objects are really interesting to study. They tell some stories that reinforce, but also some stories that differ from mainstream textual narratives of China during that century. And above all, I've been struck by the way that objects illustrate the extraordinary resilience, creativity, and adaptiveness of Chinese culture during that era, despite, you know, the many tragedies that China went through during that time. So these objects tell stories about China's multi-ethnic identities. They show how very new, often more realist approaches to painting individuals and landscapes, often informed by photography, emerged. They show the openness of elites and ordinary people to new foreign culture and technology. So that's just been a wonderful experience, a sort of challenge to tell the history of a century, not through text, but through objects. A slightly more long-range project is that I'm mulling a history of archaeology in China. So I very much welcome any members of the audience with an interest in or experience of Chinese archaeology to get in touch. I'm collecting stories and individuals for that right now.
A history of archaeology.
In China.
In China, yeah. Huh. Huh. Well, I don't know, but I'm guessing that some of our audience have some, if they're not directly involved, they probably know people who are. And I'm sure that
and I think it's a story which is very relevant to the history of the RAS. So if you look at the journal of the RAS in its different chapters, sort of South and North China, members of the foreign community, they might have different sorts of day jobs working in business or whatever in China. But I think particularly British, but many other nationalities as well, would have particular research specialisms, particular perhaps plants, science, but also archaeology, collecting different sorts of art, and so on and so forth. So those early issues of the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society, I think, are an absolute goldmine for understanding what people are interested in and finding out about at this very formative period for Chinese archaeology, which really takes off, at least within China, in the 1920s.
Kristen in our group has just sent a comment. She says, "I totally love archaeology and looking forward to your research." So you have a prefabricated fan. Probably many more.
John, have we already taken the question about Pilgrim's Progress, how we compare?
Yes.
Okay.
I probably asked it a bit elliptically. But, I think that, well, Julia, if you wish to speak that anymore, but it's a very complicated, interesting concept. I just hadn't thought of it myself. But you mentioned some of the references to similar types of developments in early modern Europe about the same time that Journey to the West was first collated.
Yeah, I think it would be, as I say, really fascinating to do a really close comparison of the two texts, and Journey to the West with other texts as well. But one thing which immediately stood out at me when I was approaching the abridgment project, right at the start, was the very striking irreverence of the Chinese text, which I thought was a really interesting contradiction or undercutting of some of the cliches that exist about China in the West, certainly in Anglophone headlines at the moment. China being a deeply and historically authoritarian culture, and yet this is a book all about mischief, disobedience, troublemaking. So, very early in the book, when Monkey is having his titanic struggle with the forces of heaven and Buddha, he actually urinates on the hand of the Buddha. And at least to my mind, I've been unable to find a similarly irreverent detail in European literatures of the same period. So I think, one of the things which really kept me very, very engaged while doing the translation was the sort of extraordinary richness and subversiveness of the stories that the book tells about Chinese culture.
John, do you mind me coming in for a second?
Oh, please, Gabor. Come on in.
Because Julia, you actually kind of introduced my question. You are in this enviable position of being familiar with the mythical past, the historical past, and the presence of China. This kind of curve of developing into modern China, and I was wondering about this. You might correct me on this because it might be anecdotal, but I read somewhere that Mao Zedong said he was 2/3 tiger and 1/3 monkey king. Where do you think playful irreverence now fits into the psyche of modern China? Because I think those Westerners have a reason to be a little bit judgmental with, for example, the social credit system and so on building up. So if you look at the media that comes out of China, for example, right now, it doesn't strike us, not just Westerners, even somebody from Singapore or the Philippines wouldn't be struck by Chinese media as particularly playful. So where is the spirit of Monkey King now?
Well, first of all, I would say that one of the really striking things about the book, the novel, and the set of stories around it is that it is a novel and a set of stories that has passed on through history, through adaptations, reimagining. So, the sequels and the retellings started to proliferate very quickly after the, supposedly authoritative 1592 version was published. And since then there have been countless adaptations across fiction, drama, in the 20th century, in comic books, film, dance, cartoons, and video games, as I mentioned. So I would say that Monkey King's Journey to the West is an interesting metonym for Chinese culture, in that it reminds us of the openness of this cultural entity. Yes, there is authoritarian government within Journey to the West, but there is also profound pushback against that. And there, I think we only need to look at the recent kind of rereadings and remakings, reinterpretations of these sets of stories of the book in contemporary China to get a sense of how open and sort of how variable Chinese culture and readings of Journey to the West have been. If you travel back to understandings of Journey to the West in the 1950s and 1960s, they're probably very different to how official China would try to deploy them now. Mao was a career revolutionary, always saw himself as an outlier, a troublemaker, and he loved the Monkey King. He loved Journey to the West, and his reading of the Monkey King and of this book was very specific. He read this character as a rebel, as a revolutionary, and this really shaped how the book was presented and read during Mao's lifetime. So between 49 and 76, his time ruling China. So during this period, Monkey's rebellion against heaven, the first 7 chapters of the novel, was emphasized above all other elements, even to the extent that the ending of this part of the story was completely changed. So rather than being defeated by the ruler of heaven, Monkey was triumphant. So the story was changed at this point in history to illustrate the Chinese communist narrative of popular revolution against oppressive rulers. So Monkey came to stand in for, the power of the people, the power of peasant rebellion. But of course, after the death of Mao in 1976, the theory and practice of violent revolution went officially out of fashion. In China, we see sort of instead a move towards a kind of authoritarian capitalism. So again, the tellings of Monkey King change subtly. So after this point in Chinese cultural propaganda or publicity, I think Monkey King became more a kind of free-floating symbol of positive, vibrant Chinese culture. But there remains plenty that's open and slippery about Monkey King today. So he's beloved of rebels, of creatives, as well as of authoritarians. So one quite recent example would be look at the post-1989 generation of students who had their sort of formative educational experiences in the 1990s, disillusioned with communism after the crackdown of 1989. And at this point, a 1995 Hong Kong film adaptation of Journey to the West became very popular because it portrayed Monkey as a kind of aimless, irreverent drifter. So, then Monkey again could express a kind of rebellion. But traveling to the opposite end of Journey to the West references in China today. So China's current leader, Xi Jinping, very much in the sort of strongman authoritarian mold. He's also clearly a fan of Journey to the West. So quite early on, after he became party secretary in 2012, he cited Monkey's covert kung fu strategies as an analogy for his own war on ideological enemies. So, the book is very, it's lent itself to many different sorts of interpretations and retellings according to the reteller, according to the audience.
There was a kind of a question in the comments about the role of the Monkey King during the Cultural Revolution. I can help a little bit with that because my wife is from Shanghai, and it was just this weekend that I talked to my father-in-law about this. And he told me that during that time, the Monkey King became the living symbol of the Tiansha Daluan, this idea that you have to create chaos in order to end up with something creative.
That's really fascinating to hear that first person testimony. I mean, Mao was reading Journey to the West on the eve of inciting the Cultural Revolution, so in the spring summer of 1966, and he explicitly said we need more Sun Wukongs to disrupt heaven. So, this is very much the sort of reading of Sun Wukong as anarchist. It leaves out, obviously, the 90 chapters of the book where Monkey is either pinned under a mountain or is, undergoing this incredibly tough journey to India and becoming tempered as a moral being, becoming a virtuous Buddhist. Again, it's a very, very partial reading of the book, but it's just so fascinating to see its applications and to hear from your father-in-law. So thank you so much for that, Gabor.
Thank you. That was another thing that came up from somebody under the nom de guerre 2002. And I would like to pose this question to both you and John, because you know an awful lot about this story and modern China, and John spends a copious amount of time dissecting Chinese and Japanese media. So if we haven't seen any of them, which Sun Wukong movie or TV show should we start with?
John, you first.
I'm partial to the Japanese version that started the whole genre, which is probably what you saw, right? That was what the BBC dubbed. I just think it is it's so over the top. It's so quaint. It's just so funny and endearing. I have not seen the Hong Kong movie from '95. I think now that you've talked about it both here and in your introduction, I should. But I vote for the first edition in the series.
Yeah, I'm no surprises here, Gabor. I'm with John on this. I have watched the 1995 version. It didn't resonate so much with me, maybe because it was more realist in its use of actors, and I'm not. There's just a certain level of violence sometimes within that sort of real actor kung fu genre, which doesn't quite sit comfortably with me. So I didn't find it as captivating as the 1980s version. But also within the history of Chinese animation, I would completely recommend going back to the Danao Tiangong, the Wan brothers version from the first half of the 1960s. Not just for the Sun Wukong character, but really looking at the visuals, because the Wan brothers very consciously wanted to create a Chinese style, sort of national Chinese style of animation that could compete with Walt Disney and Snow White and so on and so forth. And I think it's just wonderful the way they sometimes use sort of classical or sort of medieval Chinese visual motifs within it. So, for example, the attendants of the Jade Emperor, the ladies in waiting, with their sort of incredibly elegant forms sort of remind me of the depictions of female Buddhist deities in cave paintings in Dunhuang in the far west. So I think they've done something wonderfully creative with that. And as I say, I was just so struck by the way that my 8-year-old, who is not particularly immersed in Chinese culture, I do my best, but there are limits. I was struck by how captivated and engaged he was immediately by it.
Yeah, my wife made me watch one of them. I don't know if it's the 60s or the 80s version. I mean, the special effects were a little bit goofy, but that's just time. But otherwise, it was quite well made. I mean, it was made for children. But when Monkey King conjures up his monkey army from the hares, it's actually quite scary. So it might have been the 60s. I think it's most probably the 80s version.
Yeah, well, a few weeks ago I did an event at a British university, and what was wonderful about it was there was a Chinese PhD student who's doing his dissertation on Western translations of Journey to the West, but he also has a lovely Chinese reading voice, and we did a parallel text reading. So I read my translation, and then he read the original Chinese. And he did some wonderful voices. It was the section when Monkey goes beneath the ocean to demand a fantastic superpowered weapon from the dragon of the Eastern Ocean. So there are all sorts of voices. There's Monkey King, there's the Dragon King, there's all his subordinates, sort of like Colonel Eels and carps and lobsters and so on. And he did all those voices. And I asked him where he'd got the ideas for the different voices, and he said it was the 1980s version, actually. So I think that also has a purchase on people's cultural memories.
Julia, there's a question that's just come across here from David, and you've already touched on this a bit, but he specifically says, can you talk a bit about the history of the outreach of the reach of Monkey King outside of China? So in Japan and Korea and Southeast Asia, maybe even India or Central Asia. I don't know its reach. I clearly in East Asia, it is one of these stories.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I think particularly in Japan, so it's no coincidence that this version that John and I have been talking about, which I think was done in the 1970s in Japanese and then dubbed into English in the 1980s. It's no coincidence that that was done in Japan. But far more than literal adaptations of the story, there have been looser fictions, either sort of in film or anime or books, based on the Journey to the West characters and stories. The India question is a really interesting one. I should look more into that, because there are serious scholars who think that there are the origins of the Sun Wukong character lie not just in Chinese myths and legends, but also in Hindu mythology, Indian mythologies. I mean, the jury is out. I mean, it's very hard to prove that, but there are certainly striking similarities in terms of sort of mythologized monkeys in both cultures. Unfortunately, because of the geopolitical conflicts between China and India of the last 60 or so years, this has really had a detrimental impact on cultural exchanges between China and India. And of course, things are very difficult at the moment and have been for a couple of years now. But it would be very interesting to look at the impact of the story within India, whether those stories have also reached out to those parts of the world. I mean, I think that to go back to something which I was chatting with Gabor and John about, maybe right at the very beginning of the event, or while we were in the waiting room. I think what's really striking about the book and its characters is that you have a hero, a main character, Monkey King, with quite a high degree of recognition amongst Westerners who, you know, otherwise might not engage at all with Chinese culture, and probably certainly not with Chinese literature, which unfortunately still remains quite a niche interest. So you have, but so they might have heard of the character. This character has shapeshifted and kind of somersaulted across national borders to America, Australia, the UK. But many people who've had contact with Sun Wukong, the Monkey King, probably don't know that there is a book that it's based on a very, very famous book. So I think that at one point Neil Gaiman was the fantasy writer, was kind enough to retweet a notification that this translation was coming out, and looking at the responses was really interesting. You know, quite a lot of people would say, "Oh, Monkey King, I love Monkey King." What? There's a book, Monkey King? So there's this. It's a famous character, but people don't know that there is a whole kind of literary tradition and set of stories around it. So that was another powerful motivation behind doing this particular abridgment. You know, we've talked about language and accessibility. Just anecdotally, I was aware of knowing quite a lot of, you know, really serious readers, people who read in a very wide and cosmopolitan way, but they've been intimidated to pick up Journey to the West because it's such a long book, and in the full version it contains so much intricate religious, philosophical detail. So I was really hopeful that I could try to create a language and a register and a structure for the book that would be accessible to that sort of reader, and hopefully serve as a kind of gateway text for, fingers crossed, people reading the whole thing.
Well, my own perhaps jaded, biased, I don't know, perspective is I think that you succeeded extremely well. When I was reading this, your version, I also went back to the Whaley, which I'd read, I don't know, decades ago, and I was interested to see, the choices you made and the choices he made, and it was blindingly obvious to me that you had brought a modern. I don't want to say proletarian, but it's almost, it's it feels like a common people's language telling of a great story. And as much as I liked reading Whaley, decades ago, it felt then and it feels now like it's a little bit stiff, and yours doesn't.
Well, I think the issue is, and this is uncontroversial, that language changes.
Indeed.
So I think it is worth considering new translations of the classics at intervals of several decades, because language changes, and also, as I say, I'm just surmising that me as a 21st century female translator, I've obviously brought different concerns to an interest to the book as a whole than Arthur Whaley in the 1940s did, and that will be reflected in my particular choices. But I would like to pay tribute to my wonderful, exceptional predecessors in grappling with this book in English. So especially Arthur Whaley, Anthony Yu, and Bill Jenner, who put together translations, completed translations that are just a wonderful resource. And without these resources, I would have found it much, much harder to complete my own translation and abridgment. I mean, particularly the Anthony Yu book is just a miracle of scholarship in the way it got to the bottom of so many of the very, very complex, intricate religious and philosophical elements within the book. So, I mean, I feel incredibly fortunate and appreciative to have those versions to refer to.
I found it very interesting in the beginning part of our discussion this evening. You described how you'd actually blocked out the other people's choices. I was sort of envisioning like an Excel sheet, or you had like a big, Post-it notes on a whiteboard or something, and sort of graphically seeing where the various choices have been made by these various previous authors. If you didn't take a picture of that graphic look, I think you should, because I think that's a really interesting historical document.
Well, I'm afraid that my approach was considerably more low concept than that, John. I literally just created a table in Word with a spreadsheet would have been far too advanced for me. I just created a table in Word with a column for the full version, so a little summary of each chapter in the full version, and then a column for Whaley, a column for Anthony Yu's abridgment, rather than the full. Obviously, the full version is everything, and then a column for myself, and then I just pointed out where Whaley and you had included these in their abridgment, but separate to that, actually, I think maybe my column was first, because I wanted to choose for myself before I went back to Whaley and you. I didn't want to cut off my nose to spite my face. I wasn't going to not include an episode just because you and Whaley had included it, because they had really good reasons for the inclusions that they made. So I decided which episodes I like best, which episodes, given that there's a certain amount of repetition, which episodes raised a theme in the most, created a set out a situation in the most captivating or sort of entertaining or thought-provoking way. And then I saw what Whaley and you had done. But as I say, I think another thing I needed to do was, I really wanted as many episodes as possible, and there were quite a few places within the original where I could compress the original text. You didn't need so many recapitulations and so on and so forth.
Gabor, do we have time for another question?
Yes, please.
I just noticed that one of our other...
Yeah, there was one question that asked whether you think it changes the perspective that this time it's a female translator who looked at the text.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. There's been some interesting discussion about that in recent years. For example, Emily Wilson has become the first female translator of the Iliad. I'm trying to remember whether she did the Iliad and the Odyssey or just one of those books, but the first female translator of that Homeric classic. And there was in Britain, we have the BBC, and there's a program on Monday mornings called Start the Week, which brings together 3 or 4 people who've written or talked about a similar topic. And I think sometime last year they had an edition all about female translators of the classics. I think sort of within the Greco-Roman frame, that raised some really, really interesting questions. I think for me, I was just very key. There was overlap. I included all of the like Whaley and you did, all of the prologue about monkeys. War with heaven, and introduced, included all the chapters to introduce the other main characters. But I think beyond that, I was always very keen to have stories with strong women in them, and including strong female demons. So there's the scorpion fiend, a female scorpion fiend, who gives the Buddha a pretty hard time. So she really gives as good as she gets. There was the extract when they, as I say, they pass through the kingdom of women, and men have to experience pregnancy. Someone who's had 3 children. I was keen to give room to that perspective, basically, shall we say. And there's also a very famous set of stories which Whaley did not include, about a fantastic kung fu female demon called Princess Iron Fan, which is also the subject of an early Wan Brothers animation from the 1940s. So yeah, I mean, actually, I haven't mentioned one other part of how to do the abridgment. I also created a kind of focus group for Chinese readers who I really respected, many of them scholars of Journey to the West, so they really knew the story inside out, but also sort of general readers, people who knew the story but maybe sort of who knew the story through popular culture. And I would just say, you know, which are the must-have stories, because I didn't want to do a version where people felt that I left out stories which are, you know, absolutely archetypal to Chinese cultural reference. So Princess Iron Fan, Tieshan Gongzhu always came up. So, you know, I had to have her. Another episode, I'm not sure whether you included it, but Wei Li, I think, didn't, is the Bai Gu Jing, the white bone demon, which again, a lot of readers mentioned. And again, this has a very interesting social cultural history. It was another part of the story that Mao really liked, and so there were a lot of adaptations of the stories in 1960. So I think for that reason it had quite a big impact on Chinese people growing up in that era. I think there was an animation. And then another interesting cultural story, again, to bring home how absolutely intertwined this story and its characters and its stories are in Chinese culture. Jiang Qing, Mao's wife, who was purged after Mao's death in 1976, was also called the white bone demon. So, you know, once you include, you know, there are certain stories which just set so many hairs racing in terms of cultural memory. And so that was also a really important part of the abridgment selection process, you know, making sure that I'd consulted Chinese readers to sort of really understand what they felt was most precious and essential about the book.
Well, Gabor, it's almost 8:30. I think perhaps we've taken enough of Professor Lovell's time, unless there's any other questions that...
No, I think that the questions also reflect that we have taken enough information. I think now it is time to either read the book or to listen to it. I just checked on Audible. It exists in an audio book format as well, which is, I think, a perfect format for this genre too.
I've heard really nice responses from readers about the actor who
there are
did
two narrations,
the
as far as I can see.
Sorry?
I saw there were two narrations. I don't know if...
well, one might be Whaley's version, which was done by the... again, this is a very British frame of reference, but done by a very, very famous comic British actor called Kenneth Williams, again, sort of very familiar to people of my generation and older. But as far as I understand it, the one for my translation is, I think, an American actor, and people have told me that they feel it's charmingly done.
So it's on my audiobook list now. Julia, is there anything that you would really like to share with us about this work, and we have never asked you?
No, I think we've covered the sort of deep origins in my childhood, how it has infiltrated every aspect of my family life, and my sort of complex, highly technologically literate approach to organizing the abridgment process. I think we're pretty, and how I'm going to be spending the next 10 years. So I think we're pretty much there.
Thank you very much. And then, especially when we have a well-published author as a distinguished guest at History Club, there is always this question from some of the people: should they kick themselves tomorrow morning that they forgot to ask you one or another of their questions? How can they reach you?
Yes. So I have a faculty webpage at my college, which is Birkbeck College, University of London, and my email is in the public domain. So if you just visit me on that webpage and send me a note, and I'd be delighted to be in touch.
Fantastic. If
Oh, well,
anybody should
I'll
have any
mention something.
difficulty with that, then they can just reach out to us. I've just pasted the LinkedIn link to RAS China, and also I'm going to share my email address here in case anybody has questions.
And I will, well, I'm reading a note here from Kristen and from Laughlin, and they are basically saying the same thing I wanted to say, which is, that was fascinating. Thank you so much. And thanks for a wonderful talk.
Oh, well, thanks for the wonderful questions. I've really enjoyed chatting today.
Good. Well, thank you.
Thank you
again,
very much,
Professor.
Julia. Our secret hope is to have you back at the History Club at one time when we can actually physically have you here in Shanghai.
International travel, what's that?
Yeah,
I've been stuck in the viral pariah that is the UK for the past year and a half. So, but I am vaccinated, which is very wonderful and exciting. So I really do hope so much to be able to visit China again, hopefully within the next 12 months. That would be wonderful.
So
awesome. We look forward to seeing you.
We are crossing our fingers.
Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you very much, everybody. Please follow us for the upcoming events. We have almost an event a week. And then please let me know if you have any questions to Julia. We'd be very happy to put you in touch. Thank you very much again for your time. It was lovely to have you, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much. And to you too. A real pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.